Hello, my name is Grace Hasenbank, and the topic I chose for the narrated PowerPoint presentation is the Potsdam Conference. I chose this topic because it was a significant part of World War II. It helped create tensions for the Cold War, which would later take place after the war. The decisions at this conference, after all, were crucial for how the powers would interact with one another for the next century. This presentation is for Professor Maniatis' History 216 class for the winter semester of 2026. Before we begin, I want to go over what I will be covering in this presentation. First, I will describe Europe at the end of World War II. This is extremely important because without understanding the devastation and instability at that time, it's not possible to fully understand why the Potsdam Conference was as necessary as it was. Next, I will explain what the Potsdam Conference was, when it took place, who attended, and what its main purpose was. After that, I will go into the goals of the conference. These goals were not simple. They involved punishment, reconstruction, political control, and preventing future wars all at the same time. I will also discuss the state of Germany after the war, since Germany was the central issue the Allies needed to deal with. Then I will compare the Potsdam Conference to the earlier Yalta Conference, which helps show how quickly relationships between the Allies changed. I will also explain Truman's secret, referring to the atomic bomb, and show how that shifted the balance of power. Finally, I will talk about the long-term effects and why the Potsdam Conference still matters today, especially in terms of international relations. By May 1945, Germany surrendered, bringing an end to World War II in Europe. This day is also called VE Day. However, while the fighting had ended, the situation in Europe wasn't stable. The Nazi government completely collapsed, especially after Adolf Hitler's suicide in Berlin, meaning that Germany didn't have any functioning leadership or centralized government. At the same time, Europe was physically devastated. Entire cities such as Berlin and Warsaw were heavily bombed and turned to ruins. Infrastructure like roads, railways, and factories were also destroyed, which made economic recovery extremely difficult. Plus, millions of people were displaced, including refugees fleeing war zones, prisoners of war returning home, and survivors of concentration camps. A lot of these people had no homes to return to, creating a huge crisis. This situation created a power vacuum. This means that there was no clear authority or government in many areas, especially in Germany and Eastern Europe. Without immediate action, this could have led to further conflict, economic collapse, or the rise of another extremist government. Because of all these, it was important for the Allied powers to meet and decide how to rebuild Europe and maintain peace. Now, what was the Potsdam Conference? The Potsdam Conference was the final important meeting between the Allied leaders during World War II. It took place from July 17 to August 2, 1945, just a few months after Germany's surrender. The main purpose of the conference was to decide how Europe, especially Germany, would be governed after the war. This included political, economic, and military decisions. However, one important thing to understand is that although the Allies worked together during the war, they didn't have the same goals in mind. During the war, their shared goal was defeating Nazi Germany, but once that goal was achieved, their differences became much more important. This meant that instead of being a cooperative meeting, the Potsdam Conference was filled with disagreements, tension, and growing mistrust between the Allied leaders. Now I'm going to move into where is Potsdam. Potsdam is a city in Germany located just outside of Berlin. Holding the conference in Germany was symbolic. It represented that Germany had been defeated and was now under Allied control. It also placed the leaders directly in the environment they were discussing, which likely made the destruction and consequences of the war more real and immediate. Another important detail is that Potsdam was located in the Soviet occupation zone. This gave Joseph Stalin an advantage since he was essentially hosting the conference on territory controlled by the Soviet Union. The conference was held at Seligenhof Palace, which had previously belonged to the German royal family. One of the main reasons this location was chosen is because it remained largely undamaged during the war, unlike much of Berlin. This made it a practical location since it was safe, secure, and had enough space for all the delegations and meetings. The palace was located in a quiet suburb which had privacy and security, both very important for high-level discussions as such. The building had many rooms, courtyards, which allowed each ally to have their own working spaces. The Soviets actually prepared the palace for the conference by removing German royal furniture and redesigning parts of it. Looking at this image of the conference table from 1945, we can see the setting where the most discussions were held. I wanted to do a then versus now, see the differences of it. And then the conference table now. In this image, we see the same table as it exists today. The palace has since been turned into a museum, preserving the historical setting of the conference. Now, this map shows the layout of the Cecilenhof Palace, including the upper and lower floors. The marked star indicates where the main conference meetings took place, specifically in the Great Hall, where we see this table again. And here is the interior and exterior of the palace. The architecture and design reflects a sense of stability and tradition, which contrasts from the destruction seen across the rest of Germany. Now moving to the people involved, the Potsdam Conference was attended by representatives of the major Allied powers. These individuals were responsible for making decisions that would affect millions of people and shape the future of Europe. The main leaders at the conference were known as the Big Three: the United States, the United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union. Their cooperation had been important during World War II, but at Potsdam, maintaining that cooperation was much more difficult. Each leader came with different goals, concerns, and political systems in mind, which created tension. Here we have an image of Winston Churchill on the left, Harry Truman in the middle, and Joseph Stalin on the right, all together. It represents a temporary alliance that was already beginning to fall apart. Each of these leaders came into the conference with different goals. Churchill wanted to prevent the spread of communism and maintain British global influence. Truman wanted to promote democracy and limit Soviet power. Stalin was focused on securing the Soviet Union and expanding influence in Eastern Europe. And then here's an image of halfway through the conference. Churchill was actually replaced by Clement Attlee. So here's an image of that. Attlee is on the far left, Truman again is in the middle, and Stalin is on the right. This leadership change, the leadership change of Attlee and Churchill, shows how power was shifting globally from traditional European powers like Britain towards superpowers like the US and USSR. Here H.S. Truman entered the Potsdam Conference in a unique and challenging position. He had only been president since April of 1945, so he had little experience with international diplomacy compared to leaders like Stalin. Unlike Franklin Roosevelt, who built a working relationship with Stalin over time, Truman didn't have the same level of trust. This is important because diplomacy often depends on personal relationships between leaders. Without that, negotiations become more difficult and more suspicious. Truman's foreign policy approach was also different. He believed in promoting democracy and preventing the spread of communism. At Potsdam, this meant that Truman was less willing to make concessions to Stalin and more focused on limiting Soviet influence. Plus, Truman had knowledge of the atomic bomb, which gave him confidence and leverage. This may have also made him more assertive in negotiations, knowing the United States had a powerful new weapon. Overall, Truman's leadership style contributed to being more confrontational and less cooperative at the conference. Next, Joseph Stalin. Stalin's goals at Potsdam can be understood by looking at the Soviet Union's experience during World War II. Soviet Union suffered huge losses both in terms of human lives and physical destruction. Entire cities were destroyed and millions of soldiers and civilians were killed. Because of this, Stalin was mostly focused on security. He wanted to make sure that the Soviet Union would never face another invasion like the one done by Nazi Germany. This is where buffer states become important. Stalin wanted countries in Eastern Europe to either be controlled by or aligned with the Soviet Union. These countries would be a protective barrier between the USSR and Western Europe. To Stalin, this was a defensive strategy. However, to the US and Britain, it looked like expansion and the spread of communism. This difference in interpretation is important. It shows how the same action, control over Eastern Europe, could be seen as either protection or aggression, depending on perspective. Stalin's actions at Potsdam were shaped by both fear and ambition, which made compromise difficult. Now, Winston Churchill. Churchill helped mold early discussions at Potsdam. He was a strong and experienced leader who guided Britain through World War II, and he was suspicious of Soviet intentions. Churchill believed that communism posed a threat to Europe, and he was concerned that Stalin would use the end of the war as an opportunity to expand Soviet influence. This concern was not without foundation. Even before Potsdam, the Soviet Union already established influence in multiple Eastern European countries. Churchill's strong personality meant that he was willing to challenge Stalin more directly than some other leaders. But his influence was limited by Britain's weakened position after the war. Britain no longer had the economic or military power to dominate global politics the way it once had. This situation created a situation where Churchill could voice concerns, but he did not always have the power to enforce them. And Clement Attlee, he replaced Churchill halfway through the conference. Attlee's arrival marked a shift in leadership and in priorities. His Labour government was focused on rebuilding Britain domestically, including creating a welfare state, improving healthcare, and addressing economic challenges. Attlee was still opposed to communism, but he approached diplomacy in a more cautious and less confrontational way than Churchill. Because of this, Britain's role at the conference became less dominant, which allowed the United States and the Soviet Union to take the lead. This contributes to the idea that Potsdam brought about a new global power structure. Now, why did the leadership change matter? The leadership changes at Potsdam affected the outcome of the conference. First, the shift from Roosevelt to Truman meant a change from a more cooperative approach to a more cautious and firm stance toward the Soviet Union. Second, the replacement of Churchill with Attlee reduced Britain's influence. Different leaders bring different personalities, priorities, and strategies. When those leaders change, the entire direction of negotiations can shift. At Potsdam, these changes contributed to a breakdown in trust and a rise in tension, which made cooperation more difficult. Now, what were the goals of the conference? The goals of the Potsdam Conference were complex and conflicting. The Allies wanted to punish Germany for contributing to starting the war, but they also wanted to avoid creating the kind of resentment that followed World War I. They wanted to rebuild Europe economically, but also limit Germany's industrial power. They wanted to promote stability and peace, but they had very different ideas on what that should look like. For example, the United States wanted democratic governments, while the Soviet Union wanted communist systems, meaning that even when the Allies agreed on general goals, they often disagreed on how to achieve them. This tension between goals and conflicting methods is one of the big reasons why the conference was so difficult. Now, talking about Germany after surrender, Germany was split into 4 zones among the Soviet Union, France, Britain, and United States. Berlin was split in the same way among the 4, and the Nazi Party fell, leaving them with no leader. Here is an image of the division of Germany. We have the country of Germany on the right here in this image, split into its 4 zones. In the Soviet sector, we have Berlin, which was also split into 4. Everything east of here is Soviet controlled. And then here on this left image, we have the image of Berlin split up into 4. among the Allies. All right, some objectives of this conference. One was to denazify Germany. They wanted to remove Nazis from influence. This was done through the Nuremberg trials to charge for war crimes and crimes against humanity and hold people responsible for what they had done during the war. Next was to demilitarize, change the German military, prevent rearmament, meaning taking their aircraft, weapons, really anything to prevent future aggression. And finally, it was to decentralize. This was done by breaking up large groups of power, again, to prevent groups coming together and starting an uprising or aggression. Now, moving on to reparations. Reparations were one of the clearest divisions between the Allies. The Soviet Union demanded heavy reparations because it suffered the most during the war. Regions were destroyed and millions of lives were lost. From Stalin's side, Germany should pay for that damage, is what they were thinking. But the US and Britain took a different view. They believed that if Germany was punished too harshly, it could lead to economic collapse and political instability. They were concerned about repeating the mistakes of the Treaty of Versailles, which contributed to the rise of Hitler. The Soviet Union focused on compensation and security, while the Western Allies focused on stability and economic recovery. This issue was never fully resolved, which contributed to ongoing tension. And then moving on to Poland's borders. The borders were shifted westward. There was a loss of eastern land to the USSR, but they did gain former German territory. So that problem was out. And then asking the Eastern Europe question. The issue of Eastern Europe was one of the most important topics at Potsdam. Stalin already established influence in several Eastern European countries and promised to allow free elections, but the United States and Britain were skeptical of this promise after all. They feared that these elections would not actually be free and that the Soviet Union would put in communist governments. This distrust shows how little confidence the Allies had in each other by this point. The disagreement over Eastern Europe became one of the major causes of the Cold War. Now, the atomic bomb secret. The atomic bomb was one of the most significant turning points at the Potsdam Conference. When Truman informed Stalin about the bomb, he was trying to demonstrate American power and gain an advantage in negotiations. But this also introduced nuclear weapons. The existence of the atomic bomb changed the balance of power and created a new kind of tension based on fear of total destruction. Even though Stalin already had some knowledge of the project, this marked the beginning of nuclear competition between the United States and the Soviet Union. This would later develop into the nuclear arms race, one of the big features of the Cold War. And the Manhattan Project, which is a part of the atomic bomb project. The Manhattan Project was a highly secret research and development program led by the United States during World War II with the goal of creating the world's first atomic bomb. This project began in 1942 and brought together thousands of scientists, engineers, and military personnel, what makes the Manhattan Project significant is not just that it created a new weapon, but it also completely changed the nature of warfare. In the context of the Potsdam Conference, the Manhattan Project gave the United States a big advantage. It shifted the balance of power and affected how Truman approached negotiations with Stalin. And the Potsdam Declaration. This declaration was issued on July 26th of 1945 by the Allied powers, the United States, Britain, which included the United States, Britain, and China. This declaration was an ultimatum to Japan. It demanded Japan's unconditional surrender and wrote what would happen if Japan refused. One of the most important phrases in the declaration warned of prompt and utter destruction if Japan did not surrender. This phrase hinted at the devastating power the United States now possessed. The Potsdam Conference represented a final attempt to end the war without using atomic weapons. But Japan's response to the Potsdam Declaration was to reject it. There were a few reasons for this. One was there was still belief among some Japanese leaders that they could defend their homeland strongly enough to force the Allies into compromise. But this decision to reject the declaration led to the use of atomic bombs in the end. The atomic bombs that were used on Japan in August of 1945 were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, dropped by the U.S. These bombings caused massive destruction, killing thousands of people instantly. From a military side, the goal of these bombings was to force Japan to surrender quickly and avoid a prolonged invasion that could result in even more casualties. From a broader perspective, these bombings marked the beginning of a nuclear age. They showed the world the destructive power of nuclear weapons and brought forth a new kind of fear into global politics. This relation to the Potsdam Conference, the use of atomic bombs, also showed the United States' power, which increased tensions with the Soviet Union. By the time the Potsdam Conference came around, tensions between the Allies became more visible. During the war, their shared goal of defeating Nazi Germany had kept them united, but once that goal was achieved, their differences became more important. One big source of tension was disagreement over how to treat Germany, especially regarding reparations and political structure. Another large issue was distrust, particularly towards Stalin. The United States and Britain were concerned about Soviet actions in Eastern Europe and doubted Stalin's promises of free elections. These tensions reflected deeper concerns about power, influence, and the future of Europe. Now, capitalism versus communism. Conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union were two very different economic and political systems, capitalism and communism. The United States supported capitalism based on private ownership, free markets, and individual economic freedom. It also supported democratic government where citizens vote for their leaders. The Soviet Union supported communism, which involves state control of the economy and a one-party political system. These systems were opposed to each other. Each side believed its system was superior to the other and viewed the other as a threat. This ideological conflict made cooperation extremely difficult because compromise could be seen as weakening one's own system. And it can be seen as we begin to breach into the Cold War. The Potsdam Conference is often seen by historians as the starting points of the Cold War. The Cold War was not a traditional war with direct fighting between the United States and Soviet Union. Instead, it was a period of political tension, military competition, and ideological conflict. At Potsdam, we can see the early signs of this conflict: distrust, disagreement, and competition for influence. Both sides began to view each other not as allies, but as potential threats. This shift in perception is extremely important because once countries begin to see each other as enemies, cooperation becomes much harder. So while the Cold War did not officially begin at Potsdam, the conference shows its origins. Now comparing to Yalta. To understand Potsdam, it's helpful to compare it to the Yalta Conference. Yalta took place in February of 1945. The Allies were still united by the goal of defeating Germany. Because of this shared objective, the tone of the conference was more cooperative and optimistic. By the time of Potsdam, Germany had already been defeated. This meant that the focus shifted from cooperation to competition. At Potsdam, disagreements were more visible, trust was lower, and the atmosphere was more tense. This comparison shows how quickly international relationships can change, especially when shared goals disappear. However, there were still some successes at Potsdam. Other than the tensions, the Potsdam Conference did achieve some important successes. The Allies were able to agree on how to divide Germany, which helped prevent immediate trouble. They also agreed on policies like denazification and demilitarization, which were important for preventing future conflict. Plus, the Potsdam Conference, or the Potsdam Declaration, provided a clear message to Japan, although it was rejected. These successes show that in a tense environment, some cooperation was still possible. However, the conference also had big failures. Many agreements were vague and left open to interpretation, which created problems later. The issue of Eastern Europe was not fully resolved, leading to ongoing conflict between the Soviet Union and the West. Most importantly, trust between the Allies decreased. This loss of trust may be the most important failure because without trust, long-term cooperation becomes nearly impossible. These failures contributed directly to the start of the Cold War. Now, the impact on Germany and Berlin. The decisions made at Potsdam had a lasting impact on Germany. The country was divided into East and West Germany, with each side developing very different political and economic systems. West Germany became democratic and capitalist, while East Germany became communist under Soviet influence. Berlin was also divided, even though it was located within East Germany. This division lasted for decades. And now the impact on Europe. The division of Germany was part of a larger division across Europe known as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain separated Eastern Europe, which was under Soviet influence, from Western Europe, which was aligned with the United States and its allies. This division was not just physical, it was political, economic, and ideological. As we can see in the image here on the right, there is a red line drawn between the red and the blue. And that represents the Iron Curtain. And it goes right through West and East Germany. And now the impact on the United Nations. The events surrounding the Potsdam Conference reinforced the importance of international cooperation. This is where the United Nations becomes important. The UN was created to promote peace, security, and cooperation between countries. After seeing how destructive global conflict could be, world leaders recognized the need for an organization that could help prevent future wars. So while the United Nations represented hope for global peace, the reality of Cold War tensions made that goal more challenging. Now, looking at it from a historian's perspective, historians continue to debate the Potsdam Conference. Some argue that conflict between the United States and Soviet Union was bound to happen due to ideological differences. Others believe that decisions made by leaders, especially Truman's approach, had intensified tensions unnecessarily. Another perspective is that Stalin's actions in Eastern Europe made conflict unavoidable. Then looking at the long-term effects. The long-term effects of the Potsdam Conference were important and molded global politics for decades after World War II. One of the most important outcomes was the beginning of the Cold War, a period of intense political and military tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations did not fight each other directly, but they competed for global influence. One major result of this tension was the nuclear arms race. After the United States demonstrated the power of atomic weapons, the Soviet Union quickly began developing its own nuclear capabilities. This led to the competition in which both sides built increasingly powerful weapons. Another important effect was the formation of military alliances. In 1949, the United States and its allies formed NATO. This alliance was designed to provide collective defense, meaning that if one member was attacked, all members would respond. In response, the Soviet Union and its allies formed the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This created two opposing military blocs dividing the world into East and West. It shows that while the conference was intended to create peace and stability, it also contributed to a new kind of conflict, one defined by competition, ideology, and threat of nuclear destruction. And then looking at why the Potsdam Conference still matters today. Even though the Potsdam Conference took place in 1945, its effects are still in the world today. One of the most important reasons it still matters is nuclear diplomacy. The introduction of the atomic bomb during this time changed how countries interact with each other. Instead of just relying on traditional military power, nations now had to consider the possibility of total destruction through nuclear weapons. Plus, the Potsdam Conference changed the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union, which later became Russia. The distrust and competition that began during this period continued throughout the Cold War and still affects relations between these countries today. And then to summarize the who, what, when, where, why, and how of the Potsdam Conference. Begin who was involved in the Potsdam Conference. It was the big three, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, who was halfway through the conference, replaced by Clement Attlee. What was the conference? The conference finalized plans for post-war Europe, occupation of Germany, German reparations, changing Poland's borders, and the Potsdam Declaration, which wanted Japan to surrender. When did it occur? July 17th through August 2nd of 1945. Where did it take place? The Sicilienhof Palace in Potsdam, Germany. Why was it necessary? After Germany's surrender in May, the Allies needed to restructure Europe and negotiate what peace consisted of. And how? After the conference, Germany and Berlin were divided into 4 occupation zones where they were demilitarized and decentralized. And then here's a nice timeline of important events that happened in the year of 1945. In February of that year, it was the Yalta Conference, and then later in May, Germany surrendered. In July through August was the Potsdam Conference, and in August, the atomic bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In conclusion, the Potsdam Conference represents a turning point in global history. While the conference succeeded in addressing some immediate issues, it also created new tensions that would define the Cold War. Overall, Potsdam shows how difficult it is to create lasting peace, especially when countries have different goals, ideologies, and visions for the future. Thank you for watching this presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I learned a lot about this topic while creating this presentation, and I hope you did too.